Welcome to the Republican Professor. This morning we have with us David Byrne. Did I say your name right?
Byrne.
Byrne.
Yeah,
I
great.
should have
Thanks.
asked. I should have
It's
asked.
okay. But thanks for having me, Lucas.
And we have joining us from Texas, Curtis.
Howdy.
And
Hi, Curtis. How you doing?
Good. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
I'm in Southern California. And David, you're in Southern California too, right?
Yeah, right now I'm in San Clemente, Orange County.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That's great. Do you have to commute from there?
We're still remote, to be honest, at Santa Monica. I should say we're mostly remote. We're about 25% on ground, 75% online. So I'm still remote right now.
So Santa Monica, is it Santa Monica College or Santa Monica City College? I forget.
We dropped the city maybe 15, 20 years ago. So it's Santa Monica College now.
Okay. So I'm still living in the double zeros.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
So Santa Monica College. So you're doing classes through Zoom, is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, I teach Western Civ there. So history 1 and 2, Western Civ. So.
Someone is still teaching Western Civ.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, we brought David in because Dr. Byrne is a history professor, and he has written this book on the intellectual history of Ronald Reagan. I want to make sure I got that title right. Tell us what the
Ronald Reagan and intellectual history.
Ronald Reagan and intellectual history. We're going to link it up in the notes, the book. Yeah. It's published by the University of Nebraska, which is an academic publisher. That's quite an accomplishment. Congratulations.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's a big deal to publish a book like that with an academic press.
Yeah, thanks.
And so David and I connected on Twitter a while ago. Correct. And I noticed you couldn't help but notice that the book is featured there in David's profile. And so was this your doctoral dissertation that you turned into a book?
It was not, to be honest. My background is European history, which is why I teach Western Civ. But part of the focus of my book and part of the point of my book is to show how Reagan's and really America's intellectual heritage evolves out of Europe. So, people ask me, why do I study European history? Well, because American history, American philosophy, American thought, American culture comes from Europe. And Reagan epitomizes this. Ideas like freedom that Reagan loved, ideas like democracy we all love, even ideas like capitalism, even socialism, these all emerge out of the European context. So, one of the points of my book is to show how Reagan and really American thought is related to European history. So my background is European history. And there's a little bit of European history in the book because I show, how Reagan is the product, at least to some degree, of the Enlightenment, right? As Enlightenment thinkers who stressed freedom and individualism. So I try to show how these thinkers influenced Reagan.
Yeah. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can see what I'm showing. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or whatever, then you're not going to be able to see this, but I'm just showing the Amazon page there.
Thank you.
People, and we'll link that.
Thank you.
So, how did you come up with an intellectual biography idea for Reagan?
I was reading actually Reagan's speech he gave in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was coming for president. It's a classic speech among all Reagan fans. It's sometimes just called the speech or a time for choosing. Mm-hmm. And I realized there's some really interesting political ideas there. And I realized that Reagan is a significant thinker in American history. At the same time, I was reading a couple other books about Reagan that contained some of his early speeches, some of his early thoughts, some of his early ideas. And I realized that you have really an interesting figure here, someone who's been neglected as a thinker, someone who's been disregarded as a thinker, someone who's been called stupid, unintelligent. But I argue that this is a complete misinterpretation of Reagan. And in fact, he is an important thinker with important ideas for American history.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That time for choosing speech was an interesting one. I've seen it on YouTube. I think a lot of people have now. It was 1964. Yeah. Is that correct?
Correct.
And he was he at that time thinking about running for governor? of California?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, oh yeah, by that time, yeah, I think so. That's probably when his political aspirations were beginning. So I'd say, I'd say that's right around the time that he was beginning to have legitimate political aspirations. So yeah.
Do you think that he used that speech as almost like a campaign for?
I wouldn't quite go that far. I think, he definitely was tinkering with the idea of running for governor. And I think, just the opportunity presented itself. And he definitely capitalized on the opportunity. The speech was a smashing success. The Goldwater candidacy that year wasn't, but that speech was a smashing success. It really did launch Reagan into the national political discussion.
Goldwater was an interesting figure that year as well. I sometimes I wonder if he's been misunderstood. I don't know what you think about Goldwater and his candidacy as far as that. I mean, they got creamed in the election.
Yeah.
Why do you think that they got creamed in the election that year?
I think a lot of it. I think the conventional history wisdom is correct. It was a year after the JFK assassination, and there was a lot of sympathy for Johnson, for the Democratic Party. Yeah. Obviously there's tremendous sympathy for Kennedy, and this was his vice president. So I think that is, largely conventional wisdom, and I think that is mostly true. And of course, as you know, Goldwater was painted as an extremist. Some that had an effect too.
Goldwater painted himself as an extremist.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, that's definitely true. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. So yeah.
Yeah, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Line written by who do you think wrote that line?
I know Brent Bozell wrote "Time for Choosing." I don't know.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that was a ghostwritten book. I'm sorry, not "Time for Choosing." Barry Goldwater's "A Conscience of Conservative." Sorry. The "Conscience of Conservative" was ghostwritten. Yeah, but
I think Harry Jaffa wrote that line, and he taught at Claremont.
Yeah. I think you're right. I think I did read that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's credited with that line. Actually, I think he wrote chunks of that speech. But that was, I think, was that the Cow Palace in 1964?
Yeah.
The GOP convention was in San Francisco. It's hard for us to conceive of that now. GOP convention in San Francisco, but that was I mean, they used to have gun shows at the Cow Palace until just a couple of years ago, and that was banned. Anyway, but so have you been in California long?
I have.
Did you grow up here?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I grew up in the Concord area. So yeah.
Okay. I don't know that area.
It's East Bay. It's a little east of San Francisco, so it's East Bay area.
Oh, okay, cool. So you've been around for a while in California. You've seen a lot of things change.
Yeah, I remember George Duke Machen as governor, so I'm that old.
Oh,
so.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're really dating yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. All the changes. Now, how did you get interested in history and teaching?
Well, I thought about going to law school, but I worked in a law firm for about 6 months, and I quickly learned that law in the legal field is not for me. So I always enjoyed my history classes. I went to LMU for undergrad, and then I love my history classes. Yeah, and then I was a history and poli-sci major, and I transferred to Claremont after that. But I really enjoyed my history classes, and I was really inspired by learning about the past, because the past is true. I always get a groan when I tell students this, but truth is stranger than fiction, and history, it's even better than Game of Thrones. They don't agree, but I think it is. So,
I agree. It is,
because it's true, it's real, and that's what I like about history. And that's kind of what drew me to the field. It's true.
Did you have good history professors at LMU?
Yeah, I had a bunch. Yeah, it's a great college. So yeah.
Well, you taught at LMU. I've taught at LMU for over a decade. Philosophy.
Okay,
department.
Cool.
And you taught in the history department?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm a graduate of LMU too.
Oh, cool. Awesome. What was your major there?
I did a master's in bioethics there.
Oh, wow. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So I do love history, and I really appreciate you coming on, because I think I just appreciate the historical mind and when it's done well,
Right.
the historical mind of trying to understand the past in a
Right.
disciplined way, trying
Right.
to make sense of it.
Right.
What do you think the key class was that you took, or was it a key class that you took that made you
Let
think,
me
oh,
think.
I
There's
want
a
to
couple. I
do
remember
this?
taking a
Okay.
political philosophy class. I really liked Rousseau and Locke. It's kind of, my dissertation was about 17th century European intellectual history. So my dissertation was about the scientific revolution. So at least in graduate school, I was mostly engrossed in 17th and 18th century European studies. And that really began towards the end of my LMU career when I had a political philosophy class. And I remember studying Machiavelli, Rousseau, Locke, and I really enjoyed studying their ideas. Some of their names even appear in my book. So because, like I said, Reagan is a product, like we all are, we're all a product of the past. And, our ideas, our thoughts, we've all been shaped by our past. And a lot of our past lies in Europe. And of course, Reagan's no exception to that. So.
That's right. Let's look at your outline for your table of contents here. I'm going to pull it up on Amazon.
Yeah.
You have the very first chapter, Religious Roots. When I think of Reagan, I don't think of someone that went to church. I do think of someone who probably prayed, may have read the Bible regularly, was certainly sympathetic to looking at the world from a spiritual perspective. Did he grow up in church? Did he?
Yeah, absolutely. He grew up in a very Christian home. His mother, Nell, inspired the Christian faith in him. So yeah, generally your characterization of Reagan is correct as an adult, especially as president. He said as president, he didn't want to go to church because he didn't want to cause such a large scene. Once he left the presidency, he returned to Los Angeles. He started going to Bel Air Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles after becoming president. But he was raised in a very Christian home, like I said, inspired by his mother, Nell. And I think the Christian worldview shaped Reagan a lot, especially, his geopolitical philosophy. He interpreted the Cold War, I say in a Manichaean way, meaning an incredible struggle of good versus evil. So, this entire worldview that he had is rooted in a Christian context. And that, there's good and evil, they're vying for supremacy, vying for power. And, in the end, as we know, Reagan predicted the dissolution of the USSR. He predicted the USA would triumph in over the USSR. And I think all of this, at least to some degree, comes from his religious background, that in the end, good will win. So, yeah, I think religion played a critical role in shaping, especially his geopolitical philosophy.
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a view of human nature, which is
Right.
kind of an explanation for the evil that we see,
Right.
especially concentrated in specific areas. But then it is interesting that it's tempered by an optimism
Right.
and a belief in the American people as well. What do you think was the source of that optimism? I mean, how
That's a
could you
good
look at?
question. I think to some degree, Reagan is just naturally an optimistic person. You go through life.
Okay.
Some people are just pessimistic. Some people are just more optimistic. I think Reagan, just by nature, was more optimistic. You can find support for this view in the Bible too, and that
Okay.
in the end, God and goodness will triumph. It's only after Titanic conflict. But the Bible does say in the end, good will win. I'm not sure this explains Reagan per se, but I think the best explanation is just naturally an optimistic person. So.
Well, if you remember our first Armenian governor in California,
Yeah,
then you remember the Cold War.
Yeah, of course.
Because he was governor during the 80s when Reagan was president, right? Same time period, right?
Yeah.
How do you say his name?
Duke Majan?
Duke Majan. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't move to California until 1993 when Pete Wilson was governor. I just saw him the other night, by the way.
Oh, cool.
At the Reagan Library.
Oh, okay.
So it's funny, he doesn't seem to age. He looks the same. Okay. He just looks the same. It's I wish I had that issue. But I look way different than I did when I was 5. So I just, I just have this issue of aging. It's just,
yeah.
but anyway, well, the Cold War was, I tell my students, we really were concerned about the Soviet Union. I
Of
mean,
course, yeah.
Red
Yeah,
Dawn was
yeah,
a
I
real
remember that.
thing, that
Yeah, yeah,
movie.
I remember that.
The idea that it was probably less in the 80s than it was like in the 60s, the fear of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah,
But it was, if you just sat there and thought about all these nuclear weapons that
yeah,
they had and that we had,
right,
and it was
right,
mutually assured destruction,
right.
it would be, you could make a case that it would be kind of hard to have an optimistic view of that.
Yeah, that's true. I understand that. Yeah, yeah.
So
And yeah,
it
Reagan, he has kind of a reputation of someone who tried to escalate, the arms race, and it definitely is true. He did do that, but Reagan was as afraid as nuclear war as everyone else was. So he was horrified by the prospect, and he did worry about the prospects too. So
did Nancy agree with him on all this stuff?
that's
Were
a good
they
question.
glued at the hip on this?
Generally, in terms of his Cold War policies, yeah, she was more on the sideline. Nancy's biggest influence was kind of in a lot of the day-to-day stuff of running the White House. So yeah, maybe a little bit domestic policy, but foreign policy, she definitely was a secondary figure. So yeah, her influence was seen more in some of the day-to-day running of the White House, as long as at least when he was president. So
Yeah. I developed a view that Nancy was a little bit more liberal than he was. Maybe we should define some terms, because your chapter 2 is from liberal to conservative.
right.
When you use those terms, what do you mean by it?
That's a good question. I use those terms in the 21st century American context. So, I do bring up the concept of classical liberalism in my book. I would generally classify Reagan as, modern conservatives, more classical liberals. When I use the term in the book, I mean an FDR supporter. As you know, Reagan began his political career as a lover of FDR. He supported the New Deal, and he voted for FDR all 4 times. So, I use the term liberal in that sense, a Democrat in the 1930s. So yeah, that of course epitomizes Reagan.
Well spoken, like a true historian. I think a lot of people are listening to this and they're going through their Rolodex in their mind and they're like, wait, hold on, New Deal, hold on, what was that? What was the New Deal?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the New Deal was the Democratic Party, let's just say it, was the Democratic Party's response to the Great Depression.
Sure.
And the Republicans were not very popular at that time. They opposed. Isn't this true? They opposed the New Deal.
Generally, yeah.
The New Deal was, what are the major features of the New Deal?
Well, there's the Tennessee Valley Act. There's the CWA.
Well, like not in terms of what the statutes are called, but like what it gives us social security. It's a massive intervention into the economy,
Right.
regulating things like minimum wage and
Right.
the maximum work week and 40-hour work week.
Right. At the time is mostly, a lot of it's designed, of course, to provide jobs, during the Great Depression. So a lot of government works programs too. So
yeah, but in terms of creating administrative agencies in the government, in the executive branch of the government, that had never existed before.
Right. It was obviously the expansion of government. Absolutely.
Yes, radically expanding the government as a manager of the economy, basically,
right.
labor specifically, but also providing what was called a social safety net, which is something like what we call Social Security,
right?
Which was sold very differently back then than the reality is now.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit of how it's different from how it was originally sold?
Well, yeah, it was originally intended to be, a lot of these were intended to be temporary measures, and some of them were, but yeah, it was originally, to help the needy. Sorry, my gardeners are here. Can you hear that, or can you hear the
Yeah,
buzzing? Or,
I
oh,
can hear
sorry
it.
about
Yeah,
that. My gardeners are here.
that's all right.
But
Have them bring them in.
yeah,
Let's
exactly. They
talk.
can join the
What do they
discussion.
think about the
Yeah,
New Deal?
yeah,
How's the New Deal working?
yeah. But what Reagan always said is he didn't necessarily oppose the New Deal per se. It was really the Great Society that emerged in the 1960s that Reagan opposed, because it was really a lot of the New Deal was wiped away during World War II. But what really saw the blowing up of government was the Great Society. What Reagan said is, the New Deal. Reagan's family benefited from the New Deal. His family accepted, New Deal opportunities, New Deal money. But what changed during the 60s is the Great Society and the expansion of government, the expansion of a lot of these programs that really became almost permanent features of American life. The New Deal is intended to be a temporary measure during a time of crisis. The Great Society, the American society wasn't struggling in the 1960s during the Great Society, and it's really the Great Society that Reagan rejected more than the New Deal. So.
Okay. So my understanding of the Great Society in the 60s, this is Johnson, right? Was that it took the New Deal and put it on steroids, basically.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And, that's what Reagan opposed. Tremendously. It increased the scope of government even more. And what Reagan would say is to people who didn't even really need the help. Right? Again, we're not in the midst of the Great Depression. Unemployment isn't 30%. So
So the Great Society was a war on poverty.
Right.
We need a war on poverty. That's my best LBJ impression. Medicare, right? Medicaid and Medicare at the same time.
Yeah.
So that's a huge thing right there, providing government-run health care.
Right.
Now you're starting to look like some of those communist utopias that we were worried about. That's what they are trying to do. That's what they're saying they can do. They can manage the economy from the Moscow, or from Hanoi, or from Berlin, or what was the capital of Germany at that time? Was it Berlin still?
Oh,
East Berlin, was that the capital of East Germany?
Yeah. There's East Berlin, and then West Berlin was it's escaping me. Yeah.
Well, I know that there was an issue there in the early 60s, where we had to save West Berlin, but
yeah,
I wasn't sure what the capital was at that time. But anyway, after post World War II, Germany was split. And now I think it's fair to say that Reagan was he always an anti-communist?
That's a good question too. He did flirt with communism very briefly in the 30s. But yeah, he was very, meaning, he attended some communist meetings. But that was the extent of it. Yeah, he was almost always very anti-communist. So yeah, even as a Democrat, he's very anti-communist. And that's one of the things that helps explain his shift, is that after World War II, a lot of Marxists came from Germany and began entering the Democratic Party. And today we think of, the Democratic Party is, the super liberal party. But as even today there's still conservative Democrats. So what happened after World War II is a lot of Marxists came from Germany, entered the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party begins to have a Marxist side to it. And this too helps inspire Reagan to leave the Democratic Party. So
that happened during
after World War II, during World War II, after World War II. So yeah.
Okay. So
because Reagan was a registered Republican, well, he was even a registered Democrat during most of the 1950s. I don't think he formally changed his party until about 1960. In 1950, he campaigned against Richard Nixon, against a woman named Helen Douglas, when he ran for Senate. So Nixon ran for Senate in 1950. Reagan opposed him. In 1960, Reagan supported the Nixon presidency as, of course, Republican president. So it was right during the 50s that his political views, his political ideology began to shift. And as I suggest, part of that is because, the Democratic Party begins to have more of a Marxist influence. So.
That's very insightful. I love those bookends. He was against Nixon when he was running for Senate, and then he supported him for president just 10 years later.
Correct.
That's quite a change.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't want him to be senator,
right,
and then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, I think he'd be a good president.
Right.
Better than John Kennedy.
Yeah.
Well, John Kennedy was a anti-communist too. Is that fair to say?
Of course he was. Yeah. But there's a letter that Reagan wrote. But I think he might have been an editorial for the New York Times, and he describes Kennedy is kind of a neo-Marxist. So in this letter you kind of see Reagan's awareness of the rising Marxism, and he begins to apply the term at least to someone like Kennedy. So it's probably not really true, but Reagan was beginning to move so far to the right. He's beginning to see Marxism in someone like Kennedy. So
okay. Now, when you say the word conservative, you mean that someone opposes the New Deal, or
at
someone
this
who
time,
opposes?
yes. Yeah, this time, yes. Conservatives definitely opposed the New Deal. Yeah. So.
And someone who would oppose Marxism.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And those people would be labeled like fascists or something like that.
To some degree by their opponents. Yeah. To some degree, they're reactionaries. Yeah.
Okay, that seems like of course that's a tar and feather kind of thing, because the fascists were like socialists, right?
Of course. One of the things, fascists, there's a lot of similarities between fascism and communism and socialism. Part of the reason that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany end up in the same place as these awful totalitarian societies is because, to some degree, they begin from the same place.
Yeah. That's really insightful. That's really insightful, because Germany sneezed and it was communist.
Right.
At least East Germany was.
Yeah. So, these are collectivist societies. They subordinate your individual rights and liberties. They're both, products of 19th century Germany. Marx, of course, his ideas are the foundation for the Soviet Union. He's a 19th century German. Hitler, obviously, although he's born in Austria, he's influenced by these 19th century ideas too. And the common bond among these 19th century ideas is that they're rejecting what we would call classical liberalism. So the classical liberalism that is about individual rights, individual freedoms, capitalism, democracy, voting, these 19th century German philosophers, thinkers, writers opposed. And these people all, lead to both Marx and Hitler. So, and again, they're more collectivist.
Do you think of Reagan as an intellectual in any
sense
of the term?
I don't know if I go that. You'd have to, broaden the, again, how do you define the term? If you define it as someone who's interested in the world of ideas, absolutely, right? Reagan was very interested in ideas. That's part of the point of my book. He read political philosophers. He had his own political ideas, as my book shows. So if you define an intellectual as someone who has a tremendous fascination with ideas, then absolutely. Ronald Reagan certainly loved ideas. So, but again, how do you define intellectual? So,
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. He did seem to be a thoughtful person. He doesn't seem to be somebody who sits around and thinks about careful distinctions every day, but
right.
So he's not like an ivory tower kind of a person,
right?
But he seemed to be for individual rights. I mean, how close was he with Goldwater? Goldwater, I think, opposed the 1964. Goldwater opposed the 1960.
Yeah, they were pretty similar in outlook. I think Reagan was just a little softer. He was more congenial. He's just a much more likable. Yeah, he's just a much more likable figure than Reagan was someone that at least he seemed like you could trust him. So,
well, he comes off very strongly in the Time for Choosing speech, right?
Right.
he's very passionate there.
Right.
I don't
Right.
recall
Absolutely.
him cracking any jokes or anything like that. He definitely
That's
wasn't doing any
Yeah,
of
not in
that.
that speech, absolutely. But at the same time, he could, he had a sense of humor. So, he had a softer side. In that speech, that 30-minute speech, absolutely. But he did have a softer side. Of course, he was a somewhat famous American actor too. So, most of the American people, knew of Reagan even before he ran for governor. Today we forget that Reagan was an actor, and sometimes he's denigrated. They call him a B actor, but he had name recognition across the United States. Most Americans knew who Ronald Reagan was. So
Yeah, and that's huge for politics. Just name recognition alone is a
yeah,
huge thing. Um, when he ran for governor in 1966, his major opponent was, do you recall?
Brown, yeah,
So
Pat Brown.
Brown was going for a third term.
Either second or third, I forget, but yeah, it might have been a third term. Yeah, a second
It
or
would
third.
that would have been a third term, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Pat
Yeah,
Brown
yeah.
served for 2 terms back to back. Then Reagan, and then his son Jerry Brown served 2 terms back to back.
Yeah, yeah.
And then it was Duke Magian, which I can't say his name. I know the lineage,
Duke Machen. Yeah,
Duke
yeah,
Magian, and then it was Pete Wilson. Then it was Gray Davis,
yeah, yeah.
and then Gray Davis was terminated
Right.
by the governor,
Yeah.
and then it was he won re-election, Arnold, and
Right.
then next thing you know, Jerry Brown is back.
Yeah.
What in the world for 2 more terms? That guy, 4 terms. He's like the FDR of
Yeah.
California politics, or he's like the real Terminator. He just won't die. I mean, he's like this this robot that keeps coming. And then it was Newsom. Sorry, I'm kind of a nerd. I'm a
No,
politics
that's
nerd.
okay. Yeah, California politics. So, yeah.
Well, I'm not born here, but when I got here, I loved it so much, certain parts of it. But there was other parts of it that I just didn't understand. I was like, this is such a puzzling state for. It seems like there are so many people in California that have common sense, and from my perspective, anyway, it's like the state goes crazy, and I don't understand that. I'm still trying to understand how the state that could elect Ronald Reagan seems to be going so differently than back then. But I guess it has been a while. I mean, it's been since the 60s. It's been since Vietnam. How did Reagan feel about Vietnam?
About Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
that's part of the Cold War. So
yeah. He called Vietnam a noble cause. So he definitely supported Vietnam. He was one of the conservatives who argued that the problem with Vietnam is we didn't use enough force. We sent our men there to die, but we didn't equip them with enough power. So he called Vietnam a noble cause. He supported Vietnam. He just ended up with a position that we didn't give our men the proper tools, the proper backing, the proper support, really enough power. So that was Reagan's position on Vietnam. So yeah.
so that would have been a standard Republican view, I think, of Vietnam. He
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
out of any kind of out of line with Nixon. Well, I don't
Right.
know. I mean, I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, no, that's the Nixon did not give him enough backing, enough support, enough power. So yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that would have been a criticism of Nixon.
So yeah, and Ford too. As one of his, as Reagan ran for president in 1976, challenging the Ford campaign. Yeah, and that was one of his critiques because generally, Nixon and of course Henry Kissinger and Ford, they generally supported the détente policies. Détente meaning relaxation of tensions. Let's be friends with the communists. Let's try to sign peace treaties. Let's reduce our nuclear arsenal. Epitomized by SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation treaties. All this means reducing nuclear weapons, which in theory means reducing nuclear tension. But this is what Reagan opposed. So he did. There was not universal agreement among Republicans of how to deal with a communist threat in the Vietnam and post-Vietnam era. Like I said, there's Nixon and Kissinger and Ford who are preaching détente. Relaxation of tensions, reducing military spending. And there's someone like Reagan who says, no, that isn't the correct policy. We need to continue hardline policies against the Soviet Union. So.
Yeah, détente. I appreciate you defining détente for people, because I think a lot of people don't know what détente means. It's a technical term that means, usually in the context of the Cold War, that it means that that you want to basically chill out and not become aggressive, so in hopes that they're going to do the same thing, right? Do I have that right? Basically, détente.
Yeah, Reagan joked that détente is what a farmer has with his turkey until Thanksgiving. So,
yeah. How did you get Paul Kengor's? I don't know how to say his last name.
Oh, Paul Kengor. Yeah. I just sent him a note. So yeah. So yeah.
And
have you read his work?
Sure. Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm familiar with him. Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in Reagan by any means, but there's a what do you say that what would you say the best biography of Reagan's is besides yours?
That's a good, to be honest, I find the most insightful one to be Edmund Morris's Dutch. It was criticized when it came out because it kind of, it creates mythical characters. It's one of the most famous biographies, in the last 20 or 30 years, Edmund Morris's Dutch. So it did receive its fair criticism, was panned by even a lot of Reagan experts. But it's very insightful. Again, if there's one biography to really understand Reagan, I really think Dutch succeeds in that. And of course, his leading biographer is Lou Cannon. He wrote a book. He's written several books about Reagan. So one's called Role of a Lifetime by Lou Cannon. So the two leading biographers of Reagan are Lou Cannon and Edmund Morris. Lou Cannon is Role of a Lifetime. Edmund Morris is Dutch, and they're both great. So, in my opinion, like I said, Morris's book got panned, by the experts when it came out. I think the early 2000s maybe. But I found it very insightful, just trying to understand Reagan the man. So, and Reagan was a mysterious figure, and some of Edmund Morris's critics said that Morris couldn't really get a grasp on Reagan. That's why he had to resort to, introducing fake characters into the book. Reagan was a mysterious figure. But that's one part of the point of my book is what I try to argue is that if you really want to understand Reagan, Reagan famously, it's been said, no one really understood him. But I argue the key to understanding Reagan is understanding that he's an idea man first. He lived in his mind. He loved ideas. And if you portray him through an intellectual history lens, one who focuses on ideas, you really have the best grasp on Reagan. If you try to view him, through a personal lens, just as a person, he's going to baffle you. But his ideas, you get the best insight to Reagan the person. So.
Oh, that's an interesting insight. When did you first have that insight? What was it? What were you reading?
Yeah, because before I started studying Reagan as an intellectual figure, I was kind of baffled by him too. I didn't have a good sense of him. But when you understand his ideas, specifically his ideas about freedom, individual rights, his idea that freedom is a universal value, democracy is a universal value, one that can be spread even to Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, then Reagan begins to make more sense.
So in other words, you can't explain Reagan in terms of socioeconomics.
Correct.
Completely.
Correct. Even politics, it's first and foremost ideas, so yeah.
So he switches from Democrat to Republican, not because some Democrat really made him angry and I'm never going back.
Right.
It was that the ideas didn't fit with what he thought America really was.
Exactly. Yeah. Of course, he's a patriot too. He loved America. And, for him, he says, America is an idea. He's, America, we're not like other countries. I can't move to France and become a Frenchman, but you can come to America and, become an American. And that's one of the things he loved about America is, America represents an idea, an ideal, specifically the ideal of liberty and freedom and democracy. So,
and we have to be careful that the government doesn't undermine that idea. The American government is itself possibly a threat
Right,
to
that's Reagan would have argued that. Yeah,
that idea. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually, to kind of bring this to more present day, that's kind of one of the themes he introduced to the Republican Party that Trump, picked up, was that this idea that, there's kind of two different classes, two different groups. There's the Washington, D.C. bureaucrats, and they're kind of our opponents. They're fighting against us, Reagan said. So, we need to shrink government, reduce the power of Washington, D.C., and instead give power back to the people. And, to some degree, Trump picked up on these themes too. So.
Yeah, when I think of Trump versus Reagan, there's a couple of contrasts. One is that Trump seems less of an idea man to me,
Yeah.
but he also seems more caustic in terms of his personality.
Absolutely.
He's Reagan was so like there's something you can look on YouTube, Reagan's humor, where it's like, segment of him kind of jibbing and ribbing, I guess is the word I want to use, his Democrat opponents. And sometimes it's self-deprecating,
Right.
seems like. And he was very congenial, it seems like. I mean, he would get people to laugh. He would get like I could have swore I saw in the 1984 Mondale thing exchange where he got Mondale to laugh.
Right.
So, but at the same time, I'm old enough to know that Reagan was hated, and it's hard for people to understand that he was hated. I remember my teachers hated him in public school, and not all of them, but there were some vocal teachers I had, like even in 8th grade, and I just didn't understand that. I was like, well, why do you hate this guy? I don't get it.
Yeah.
Why do you think that Democrats hated him?
Yeah, I think to some degree, he was portrayed as an extremist. He did want to renew the Cold War. For Democrats, they did see him not just as a political threat, but a threat to the world. He certainly did, step on the gas when it came to the arms race. He did increase not just military spending, but he wanted to increase, nuclear spending. He resisted any attempts to scale back nuclear bombs, and at least initially, right? He changed his position in the middle of the 80s, but they did see him, rationally or irrationally. Someone as a man who could literally bring the end of civilization. So, yeah.
Well, he did run, I believe, on abolishing the Department of Education.
Yeah,
which I found out later.
But
I didn't know that.
That had just been created. Yeah, that has just been created. I think it was under Jimmy Carter that it was elevated to a federal cabinet position. So yeah, that was actually still a new position, the Department of Education. So back then it wasn't as radical as it is today, because it had only been around for a few years. So yeah.
I personally would have no problem abolishing the Department of Education. When I tell my students in LA that the Department of Education is basically 4,000 bureaucrats that are 6-figure bureaucrats, not a single one of them is a teacher, which is kind of Orwellian. It's like that the amount of money that goes into that bureaucracy that could be in classrooms across America with like going to teachers, like, I don't know about you, David, but I think that teachers could be paid a whole lot more. I think it's kind of a struggle to make it in LA for teachers, professors as well. We're not well supported, especially with gas prices going up, with adjuncts. Adjuncts are really paying for it. And yeah, so that's my view on it. And I'm not really sure what good the Department of Education does, but in any case, I think it's interesting that it never happened. Reagan got elected, and lo and behold, the Department of Education is still around.
Right.
And I'm not sure how to interpret that. I don't know if that he just gave up the fight, or if the fight was the bureaucracy, what maybe some people call the deep state, which is just another term for the bureaucracy, is a political actor, and it can defend itself. What do you think?
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Yeah, in the end, the bureaucracy won. As Trump, constantly pointed out, the bureaucracy is very powerful, and is maybe to some degree he learned. And Reagan has a quote that basically says, no government program ever voluntarily abolishes itself. So and once a government program begins, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and more powerful, and more powerful and more powerful.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true with the Department of Education. So.
Well, yeah, and even with the entitlements, like the most of the federal government is just transfer payments, entitlements. A lot of people don't know this. It's at least 2/3 of the federal budget is just transferring money from one person to another, and the government takes a chunk of it for itself. There's an extraction of a fee,
right, exchange rate.
Yeah, because the government has to pay for its sedans and its cell phones and keep the lights on and
right. And that's exactly what Reagan said.
Yeah.
Especially with something like welfare, Reagan used the point, let's not, all this money that we're spending on welfare, well, most of it isn't really going to help the poor. Like you said, most of it is going to help, feed the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
So,
and those people have very good jobs. They have the tax money supports huge salaries for these people. I mean, Washington, D.C. is an incredibly expensive place to live. It's one of the most expensive cities in America. And some of the Virginia suburbs and Maryland suburbs around it are some of the most expensive places to live in the United States. So yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people don't understand that the government doesn't generate its own money. It needs money from private citizens, private corporations and stuff like that have their own wealth generated in the economy, meeting needs from people in a free exchange. The government takes from that in order to provide stuff. And so you have to keep your eye on whether that's going too far, whether that's to what extent that government is starting to take now more than it really deserves or more than it's useful for it to take for everybody. So I think when I think of Reagan, I think of someone who had his eye on that. And he was like, okay, this is, you got, and to me, I can't separate that from the Cold War issue,
right,
and the Marxism issue, because when I think of, like what you said, collectivism versus individual rights and individual liberty. Do you think that Reagan, to what extent does he deserve credit for the end of the Cold War?
That's a good question. Historians continue to ask that question. And certainly his reputation, his significance has grown over the last 20 to generally, he deserves at least some credit. Historians would argue anywhere from some credit to a lot of credit. Specifically, what the sources from the Soviets show is that they were influenced by the military buildup. It's certainly true that Reagan invested heavily in the American military in the early 1980s. And what began to come out of the Soviet Union, in the 90s and early 2000s, is that the Soviets were greatly worried about the military buildup. And as Reagan predicted, what it did is it showed the Soviets how inferior they were, at least in military spending. That was critical in the Cold War. As the arms race was a critical portion of the Cold War. Arguably, the arms race defined the Cold War. And when the Soviet Union realized they were unable to keep up, they recognized that some sort of major reforms, specifically Gorbachev recognized some major reforms had to begin to occur in the Soviet Union. So, it wasn't a coincidence that Gorbachev in the mid-1980s starts talking about, democracy, voting, change, right after Reagan's military buildup and his investment in the American military. Because like I said, it showed the Soviets that, their system was faltering. It could not keep up in the central Cold War component. Something had to change.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about here, and we really appreciate you writing the book. Again, it's called Ronald Reagan, an Intellectual Biography by David Byrne.
Yes.
And David T. Byrne. It's available on the Mississippi, the Nile, the Ganges, or whatever other river you want to buy a book from.
Yes.
And we know that you got to go and we got to go, and
Right.
we're sad to leave so soon. We'd love to talk about what it's like with your teaching in LA and what the kids are like these days. I call them kids. You probably don't call them kids.
Yeah. I do
But
sometimes too.
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks for having me, Lucas. It was great.
yeah, thanks, David. It was great to connect with you.
Cool. Well, have a good day. We'll talk again.